was called the War of Races. Over 100 dead in what has been cited as the bloodiest single instance of racial carnage in the Reconstruction era. Rising out of the divisive Louisiana election of 1872, the Colfax Massacre was a deadly manifestation of the partisan, racial, and sectional conflict that polarized the Reconstruction South. In turn, the ensuing U.S. v. Cruikshank Supreme Court decision significantly relaxed federal intervention in the South, sacrificing the civil rights of African Americans for a resolution of sectional differences. By relaxing federal intervention in the South, the U.S. v. Cruikshank decision continued a pattern of compromise between the Republican federal government and Democratic state governments, restoring white supremacist rule and leaving the blood of countless individuals in its wake. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the South lay in ruin. The destruction of the dominant plantation system of agriculture created a long-term economic downturn, while millions of newly freed slaves were left without federal protection. This was to change. After Republicans gained control of Congress in 1867, they ushered in a period known as Congressional Reconstruction. Congress went to work, ratifying the 14th and 15th Amendments, which guaranteed African Americans citizenship and voting rights, while appointing African Americans to political office across the South. To further protect the political standing of African Americans, Congress passed the Enforcement Acts in the early 1870s, which banned white supremacists from colluding to violate the constitutional rights of African Americans. However, even at the height of radical Reconstruction, the tide of progress was met with backlash from conservative whites who wanted to preserve the racially stratified status quo. Much of their resentment was directed at Northern Republican politicians appointed to Southern governments, disparagingly termed carpetbaggers. Viewing the administration of Republican President Ulysses Grant as corrupt and tyrannical, Southern whites flocked to the anti-federalist message of the Democratic Party, setting the stage for massive political conflict. Nowhere was this conflict more pervasive than in Grant Parish, Louisiana. Located in central Louisiana, along a bend in the Red River, Grant Parish was centered on the small town of Colfax. With substantial populations of both freed slaves and poor whites, Grant Parish was a microcosm of the conflicting ideologies that shaped the nation. After years of simmering tensions, the elections of 1872 were a breaking point. Statewide, the gubernatorial election pitting carpetbag Republican William Pitt Kellogg against Democrat John McHenry was inconclusive, with each candidate forming their own government. In Grant Parish, the local Democratic Party used voter intimidation to elect white supremacist Christopher Columbus Nash and Alphonse Cassapé as sheriff and parish judge, despite numerous Republican objections. Partisan violence flooded Louisiana, with riots and murder common. Colfax was no exception. After learning Democrats were planning to take the Grant Parish Courthouse by force in the spring of 1873, African Americans fled to defend it. With minimal weapons, they fortified the courthouse, preparing for battle. Then, on the night of April 13th, white supremacists flocked from surrounding parishes, marching on the courthouse to reclaim control. Despite encountering initial resistance, their high-powered rifles and cannons quickly overpowered the African Americans. By daybreak, the blood of over 100 African Americans stained the riverbanks. After a lengthy manhunt, many of the perpetrators, including Sheriff Christopher Columbus Nash, were captured and tried in violation of the Enforcement Act. After a jury convicted them, a circuit court judge validated the convictions. However, Supreme Court Justice Joseph Bradley, riding circuit, overturned them. Bradley's ruling was twofold. First, he argued that the 14th Amendment only applied to the state, so individuals could not be charged in violation of the Enforcement Act. He also claimed that such instances of political violence were under the jurisdiction of the state courts and not the federal government. In a time when the political platform of the Republican Party was shifting from one of intervention to appeasement, Bradley's ruling represents a compromise between the federal government and democratic state governments throughout the South. With the split decision, the case went to the Supreme Court in 1875, where the mainly Republican justices unanimously affirmed Justice Bradley's opinion, striking a fatal blow to the federal government's attempts at Reconstruction. In a letter to the Attorney General, William Pitt Kellogg said that the Cruikshank decision was regarded as establishing the principle that hereafter no white man could be punished for killing a Negro, and as virtually wiping the Ku Klux laws of the statute books. Kellogg was right. In Louisiana, Christopher Columbus Nash founded the White League, an organization devoted to the preservation of democratic rule in the Deep South. After perpetrating a wave of violence through the state, the White League launched an insurrection against William Pitt Kellogg's government in 1875, gaining control for 3 days before federal troops were summoned. William Wheeler, a Republican congressman sent to investigate the violence, attributed it to the Republican policy of trying to promote peace with the sword. To resolve the years-long political conflict, he initiated a power-sharing compromise, allowing Kellogg to serve out his term as governor but giving control of the state legislature to the Democrats. After Kellogg left office in 1877, Democrats would control the government of Louisiana until 1980. Emboldened by the Supreme Court's ruling in the Cruikshank case, members of the White League in Mississippi began a brutal suppression campaign to prevent Republicans from voting in the local elections of 1875. Despite being a minority, Democrats gained a 4-1 advantage in the state government, leading to the resignation of Republican Governor Adelbert Ames. Nationwide, the presidential election of 1876 saw a tightly contested race between Republican Rutherford Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden. After enormous political turmoil, an election commission voted to give Hayes the presidency. In exchange, the final federal troops were mandated to be removed from the South, placing it under total Democratic control. Hallelujah, proclaimed the Louisiana Democrat after the election. The Republican Party is dead. The Compromise of 1877 was the culmination of years of dueling political conflict and ideological compromise, exemplified by the Colfax Massacre and the narrow interpretation of the 14th Amendment that followed. The South would never be the same again.
Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar tree.
Today, along the silty banks of the Red River, one will find little indication that the Colfax Massacre occurred. All that remain are 2 monuments. One, erected during the height of white supremacist activity in the 1920s, celebrates the 3 people killed fighting for the white supremacist cause. The second, put up by the Louisiana Department of Commerce and Industry in 1950, justifies the carnage by stating it brought an end to carpetbag misrule in the South. Colfax remains a society entrenched in inequality. Despite 2/3 of the population being black, few hold leadership positions within the town. The poverty rate for the African American population of Colfax is 40%, more than 3 times greater than the national average. The wounds of the past have not yet healed. The legacy of the Colfax Massacre is one of violence, inequality, and denial. While many characterize the civil rights movement of the 1960s as a second, more successful incarnation of Reconstruction, it is shockingly clear that the issue of racial equality that polarized the nation during the 1870s remains relevant today. We must prevent this vicious cycle of oppression from repeating itself by remembering the Colfax Massacre for what it was: a conflict that defined Reconstruction, and a compromise that ended it.